doing? How y'all doing? I know it's been a long day, but we're at the toots end of it all. So we're excited that you guys came out to be with us. We're very grateful that you're here. We know it's a Friday, so y'all could really be doing anything, but you spent it with us. So thank you for that. So it's not just me for this panel. We also have a lovely co-crew that I will be having the luxury of speaking to today. So I'm going to invite them to the stage right now. So if Miss Ebony, if you would like to come up to the stage, give her a round of applause. Miss Ebony is a senior legislative counsel at Earth Justice. So give her a round of applause. Next up, we have Miss Jana Parker. If you'd like to come up as well, give her a round of applause. You're all good. Yes, ma'am. I'm going to give them some time to introduce themselves, but just so you guys have some context as to who we're inviting to the stage, Mrs. Parker is the executive director of PG Changemakers. So give her a round of applause for that. And last but not least, we have Mr. Russell Armstrong. If you'd like to join us on stage, give him a round of applause. Mr. Armstrong is the policy director for climate and environment at the Hip Hop Caucus. So another round of applause for him. All right, y'all, I'm not going to ask you to clap again for a while, so we're good now. But I'm going to ask Miss Ebony to introduce herself for just 1 minute. Oh, she got a mic already. I don't even got to pass it.
Can y'all hear me? Hey, y'all. Hi, I am Ebony Griffin Guerrier. Like Chris said, I'm Senior Legislative Counsel at Earth Justice. I focus on cumulative impacts specifically and how cumulative impacts and environmental justice kind of intersect with all of the things. Before Earth Justice, I was the environmental justice staff attorney at a small nonprofit in Philadelphia called the Public Interest Law Center. And there I focused a lot on ag and conservation and environmental justice and working with frontline communities to kind of figure out what the issues are and how best to tackle them, which kind of led me to pivot into policy work and kind of how I ended up at Earth Justice. I also went to law school at Howard, so I have a fondness for the HU. HU, you know. That's it.
All right, love.
So yes, I am Jana Parker. I am the executive director of PG Changemakers. For those of you who go to Howard University, you know Prince George's County is right around the corner. And PG Changemakers is a grassroots organization that focuses on racial and social justice issues within Prince George's County. A lot of times, because we have predominantly black and brown legislators and representation, people don't think that we don't have the issues that would affect people that don't have that type of representation but are black and brown, but we do. And so we work to uplift those issues and get resolutions that are community-centered and community-focused, and really bring our legislators to bring change within our community. One of the biggest things that I always harp on is that it's not just enough to have people who look like you as legislators. You have to have people who are really going to be acting on the interests of you now and in the future. So we do focus on racial and social justice issues, one of them being environmental justice and conservationism. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Russell Armstrong, and so I'm the Senior Director of Campaigns and Advocacy at the Hip Hop Caucus. But I also have experience doing policy and campaigns at the state, local, and national level, and seeing how environmental justice, economic justice, democracy, and human rights, civil and human rights, have impacted our communities. And so today I'm going to want to talk about like the intersectionality of environmental justice issues with our essential basic human rights and needs as Black people.
All right, everyone, with that being said, we're going to get started off with our questions. So to start us off, I think we all know that the word justice is a very broad term. It can be used in many different contexts, but today we're going to be talking about environmental justice, something that has obviously become more important over the recent years as our environment is clearly changing and our policies are not. So the question becomes, what are the key principles of environmental justice and how do they relate to conservation efforts? Ms. Ebony, if you would like to start.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when I think about environmental justice, I think about righting wrongs and trying to prevent continued degradation of or continued perpetuation of those wrongs. Basically, environmental justice to me means that no matter where you live, what you look like, what your zip code is, your health status, immigration status, that you have equal access to a healthy environment, right? Like it shouldn't matter if I live on this side of town versus this side of town, whether my drinking water is contaminated or whether I can, actually eat the food that's growing in my backyard. So, on top of that, I also think that, what gets left out of the conversation around environmental justice a lot is who is and who should be making the decisions on what that justice looks like. And to me, it's very important that we prioritize people who have the lived experience of environmental injustice, environmental racism, environmental justice or environmental injustice. There's a long history of it, right? If you look back to even redlining, you can kind of see that when trying to basically figure out, where all of these polluting facilities are, where the hugely contaminated areas are, where the environmental justice communities are. Usually it's overlapping with the communities that were redlined. So there is inherent racism, embedded in our environmental laws and environmental policies. And so really the focus should be on undoing those, but also working with the people who are the most impacted by those racist policies to figure out what the progress is. How do we make the change to get to where we need to go?
I think that's just so excellent of an answer. If I could just say ditto and pass it. But no, I think that environmental justice actually challenges the notion of whitewashed conservationism and the perspective that conservationism and that thought process was here in America before people came over, colonizing and whatnot. And so bringing that into environmental justice from the perspective of, a lot of times conservationism is taken from the perspective of how people want to save this land, make this land greater, preserve this land without the thought process of the people that it affects. Particularly indigenous people, people of color, black and brown people. And subsequently, I feel like environmental justice challenges that whitewashed notion of what conservationism is and what it should be. And it pushes back on allowing us to understand that, there were things that have been institutionalized and put in place to harm our communities, using the environment, using pollution, using all of these things. And environmental justice seeks to call that out, put that at the forefront, and change those particular institutionalized issues. Another thing about it is, with environmental justice, is just making sure that the people that are most affected are the people at the forefront of making the decisions, but also that they understand the complexities of the decisions. And that's not to belittle someone's understanding, but a lot of times just making sure that they understand, hey, if this is here and this is here and this is here, this is how this is going to affect everything else. And making sure that it's very clear. One of the things that I really advocate for is educating people on the issues, fully educating them so they can make a very conscientious decision that is in the best interest of themselves.
I don't know how I can pick up off of that. You already got two excellent answers on what environmental justice is, but just to add to it some context, that the term came up back in the 1970s because of folks who were organizing themselves in North Carolina against the pollution and toxicity that was existing in their neighborhoods. But as noted, anytime you add justice, it's basically our way of framing that you need to do right by black and brown people and people in the community. When we talk about climate justice, we're talking about doing right by people in the global south who are at the front lines of what's happening to their communities, of hurricanes, of typhoons, cyclones. We have flooding, people dying from flooding in Libya and earthquakes in Morocco, all of these things that are driven by fossil fuel disasters. And so environmental justice just means doing right by the environment and doing right by the people who are first and worst impacted. And so we'll start there, and then from moving forward, hopefully that we get a framework where people are doing right by the people who have to exist in this world, who have to live in this world, who have to be at the front lines of these disasters that continue to happen day after day, year after year.
Lovely. Thank you for those answers. We appreciate that. We're going to move into our second question. When we're talking about environmental justice or just the environment in general, we oftentimes hear a lot more stories of failure than success. We also oftentimes hear a lot more of a pessimistic tone because, as we can see, our environment is faltering. And although we are fighting a fight, it's an uphill battle, right? So there's not really much encouragement that we hear when we're reading headlines or we're looking at research. So what I want to ask you all is, can you provide examples of conservation initiatives that have successfully incorporated principles of environmental justice?
Not necessarily, well, I'll talk about it from the lens of just moving and thinking about the environment and climate change. I know in Prince George's County there was recently passed a bill that focused on the plastic bags and the paper bags and things of that nature. And that was a big issue from the perspective of, again, the intent of the bill is very well, it's great, but then the impact, right? Marginalized communities will now have to pay 10 cents for bags or whatever may have you to come in when they're getting their groceries. And one of the things that, from the positive standpoint, is one of our county council members is putting in legislation to address that in relation to people who are on SNAP or on WIC or in marginalized areas would not have to pay for bags or things of that nature. But that kind of ties into environmental justice, climate change, and people being at the table when these decisions are made, right? Because the overall thought process is we want to address these climate change issues. And we want to do it by like this, right? But it's not thinking about the marginalized communities that are going to be directly affected when you're living in a certain area and you're going to the grocery store and you just got off work. You're not thinking about the bag that you should have left in your car to go get all the groceries that you need. You're just coming to get groceries and things of that nature. So I think that highlighted that if you don't have people that not just look like you, but actually know your experience, listen to you, talk to you, you're going to have decisions that are going to happen to you that impact you that are not going to be in the best interest. And I think it just underscores my point of making sure that the people that represent you don't just look like you, but they have your interest in mind. So from that perspective, I think it's a very good policy that she's putting in place in regards to addressing that issue.
Excellent point. I think it's a little harder for me to find an example because when I think of policies, environmental policies specifically, that are, the aim is to address environmental injustice, it's always a question of, okay, is the policy good? Maybe, but then what about the implementation? And so what comes to mind to me is people are trying. There are some municipalities that are trying. In Philadelphia, for example, there's been a big push to require community benefits agreements as part of general development. So when I was at the Law Center, basically we would work with a lot of community organizations, RCOs, community gardens, and inevitably, there was always a developer that came from somewhere who was either trying to buy something next door to where the community garden is, or the community garden had some delinquent taxes on it, and so it was sold at sheriff's sale to the developer, and the developer wants to come in. And so usually what will happen at that point is there's a hearing, right? We have to go and see if the developer can get a variance to do whatever the thing is that they want to do on this property. And so the policy is such that you have to have the impacted community at the table, and the impacted community has a say in whether the variance is granted and whether there are any conditions on that variance and whether there's a community benefits agreement that's put in place. But really, in implementation, what usually ends up happening is you have these developers that are just, lining people's pockets or threatening people in the community if they, go against the variance. So yes, there are policies in place that aim to or seek to address environmental justice or injustice, but the implementation of those is a whole different story.
I kind of wanted to say something on that in regards to developers. Not to demonize developers, because I'm sure there's great environmentally conscious developers, but oftentimes in these conversations, it's the developers that are causing a lot of the environmental harm, specifically in communities of color and people of color, and that portion of threatening people and things of that nature, that really happens. This isn't something that is just thrown up in the air. Can you imagine living in your community, staying in your community for years, even having familial roots for 2 or 3 generations, and a developer is coming in physically threatening your livelihood, your existence. And I don't think that that's talked about enough in regards to the challenges around environmental injustice.
So I do want to, I agree with everything that was said, but I do want to highlight that there are some positive movements in terms of trying to incorporate environmental justice principles and principles of equity into law. And not only that, that there are also examples of where people have challenged, whether it's fossil fuel plants, petrochemical plants, and won on grounds of principles around environmental justice. For example, we work with a group, and so does Earth Justice actually, in Louisiana called Rise St. James, and they have fought for years against the petrochemical industry that persists in Cancer Alley, and their home along the Mississippi River. Long been home to black folks since before the time, since antebellum times. And to that point, they won in suing and stopping the Army Corps of Engineers from approving a plant by Formosa, a foreign company, to come in and pollute more of their land. And they used it on the grounds of permitting reform, and they used it on the grounds of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and saying that these environmental assessments that are being done are not complete, they're not accurate, and we can show and demonstrate that this would cause more harm to the people who are living here, creating more cancer, more death, more asthma to folks who already suffer that at disproportionate rates. So that's an example of how like people win on equity. The same thing happened just out here down the road in Richmond with another pipeline that was being approved with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. They're the same. Once again, a community fought against and won against a developer who had basically was bought and paid for politicians within the Virginia government to against trying to get a pipeline approved and a compressor station in Union Hill, a black free person community. And because that group combined with other local activists fought persistently, they were able to win, again, on the grounds of saying that this, we can tell that this disproportionately is going to impact the people that live here and that we don't want this in our community. Now, there's been enough said about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and how like it both has given like the most money that has ever been allocated for climate and climate justice initiatives. But at the same time, it also lends itself to more drilling, more gas, more sacrifice of the Gulf South. But there are some principles laid in there, particularly around Justice 40, which means that 40% of the benefits of that law are supposed to go to communities of color. But we, as a community, also have to push back and say, like, what does that mean? What are you talking about benefits? Where do we see the actual dollars? So there have been gains, like while there are definitely still challenges, there have been gains, but just like everything else in history, those gains are always incremental, and so we have to continue pushing.
Yeah, I just want to, yes, 100%, I agree with that. And thank you for pointing out St. James Parish. I do want to point out that while, again, it goes back to implementation, because while we do have some really good, in theory, environmental policies on the books, we also, have scenarios where industry takes advantage of that. And we're in a situation right now where that exact same community filed a Title VI complaint against the industry that was doing all of this polluting. Title VI basically says, and don't get me wrong because I'm not a Title VI expert, but basically it's like you can't have any evidence of intentional discrimination or disparate impact and still receive funding from the federal government. And so this community filed a Title VI complaint against that industry, and EPA launched the investigation, and then industry came in and was like, oh yeah, nah, this is racist. We're gonna sue y'all because they're trying to make us do all of this stuff. And because of the current makeup of the Supreme Court and some of the recent Supreme Court decisions around race-related language and race-related policies, we're at a very interesting time in our environmental justice advocacy work, because you have to be careful in the sense of how we're advocating for these environmental justice focused policies and sort of these racially motivated racially motivated decision making in a more positive direction, because there is we're kind of under attack right now in terms of our ability to continue to rely on some of the same statutes that we've been able to rely on for those protections.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for those insightful answers. I can't claim myself to be an environmental justice expert, but after listening to that, I think I learned a couple more things that I'm going to take home with me. So thank you all for that. We touched on this in this discussion that we just had on this question, but our next question would be, how can we ensure that conservation projects don't inadvertently harm marginalized communities or worsen existing inequities? It's a loaded question, I know.
So we were just talking about developers, right? And how developers a lot of times end up being kind of at the crux of these issues that are impacting our communities. They get bonuses, they get tax rebates, they get all sorts of things to develop, whether that's developing, their own condo buildings or associations that end up pushing people out, or like determining where like certain grocery stores are placed. So oftentimes it's on, like, we have to think about conservation projects, particularly like, for example, things like the, tree planting initiatives and urban greening initiatives, but they end up being placed in areas where there's less of us already, and that the prices are higher, and they end up driving up market prices, pushing more people out to bring in different people to move into those communities. So you have to always be like on your head on a swivel about like these sorts of things where like, they're trying to come at us and they're trying to push us out, and it's like the same old devil again. It's that gentrification coming around. And while like, we should all feel the need to like, we want to all move on up and like be able to live in different places. I like a good grocery store too. I'll go to Wegmans if I can, but at the same time, I don't want to have to be pushed out of my community just because I like to have trees and want to be able to breathe. So those are the sorts of things that can be seen as like a conservation effort, but if they're not targeted, if they're not placed equitably, they can end up doing more harm than good.
You're going to see a constant theme with me. When we vote people in, they have to have our interests in mind. They can't just look like us. And I say that from the perspective of when you have these quasi-governmental boards, committees, commissions, they are generally appointed by those who are in power, those who we elect. And if we elect people who look like us but may have gentrification in mind, may have been funded by developers, may have, they have ties to these people that they have to answer to, then yeah, you're gonna get trees in, College Park. I'm just being frank. You're gonna get trees in College Park. You're gonna get trees in Mount Rainier. But you might not, get trees in certain parts of Hyattsville, right? Or certain parts of District Heights or inside the Beltway. And that's not because those areas don't deserve it. It's because those areas are being represented, possibly, by people that look like us but don't have that sort of mentality of this is what we're going to do. You have to think about, there's a lot of marginalized communities that have vacant lots, that just have these areas of mass openness that could be converted to community gardens, that could be converted to just open spaces, green spaces, wonderful places for people to interact and be in. But you have to have people who have the vision for that. You have to elect people that have the vision for that from a city planner perspective. I know Prince George's County has the largest amount of municipalities within the state of Maryland. A lot of people don't understand why. There's historically a context for that. There are a lot of sundown towns, a lot of white-only communities, and then there were a lot of areas that were black-only because they were, putting things in place for their residents so that they could get the services that they were not receiving from the county at the time, right? But then when you think about it from context so from this municipality perspective, from a county perspective, and from a state perspective, you still need to make sure that you're electing people on all those levels that are saying, okay, hey, when we think about a conservationist, we're thinking about this municipality. When we're thinking about where we're going to put a new grocery store, we're thinking about inside the Beltway. When we're thinking about moving on up, we're thinking about moving up the areas, right, that need the support, not giving a whole another millions of dollars to the areas that have consistently had millions of dollars for 30, 40, 50, 100 years. And I think that's a big conversation to talk about in regards to conservationism and environmental justice, and making sure that we're not causing harm to those communities, making sure that we make sure those communities are at the forefront of those decisions. The only way you can make sure that those communities are at the forefront of decisions is by electing people that, view the same thing. And when you don't, you don't.
Yeah, along similar lines, always want to see who's on staff, because what I've learned from my work in the EJ space is that our people, our communities, we're used to doing a whole lot with very little. We are a creative and resourceful people. And so if you put people in a situation where they have power, like actual power, to make change, they gonna run with the ideas. The ideas are not the problem. It's really access to the table, right? So, just making sure that we are electing people and putting people in positions of power who recognize that, who acknowledge that, but also who really believe it. Because it's one thing for politicians to, do their whole thing, or their, campaigning, and they go into the neighborhoods and they listen to people and they're talking about, okay, well, we're going to do this. I know that this is a problem here, but do you really understand what the problems are, and are you really talking with the people who are living it on a daily basis and have ideas for how to fix the issues?
Absolutely. Thank you for those answers. We appreciate that. So on the topic of politicians that are, more conscious about our environmental justice and, meaningful or so, this past month in July, President Biden took a visit to the Grand Canyon where he basically created a new national park for the indigenous, right? So that leads us into this question, since now that environmental justice, especially with the indigenous people, has been, coming into the top of the conversation. The question is, what role do indigenous and local communities play in conservation efforts, and how can we respect their rights and knowledge? For anyone.
So it's really interesting. This area, Prince George's County, DC area, is home to indigenous people, and has been home to indigenous people for hundreds of thousands of years, if you will. But when you think about conservationism, I always think historically from the perspective of they already had a plan in regards to protecting, conserving, and respecting the land, and they were utilizing that for hundreds of years. Granted, we're now hundreds of years in the future, and there are some technological aspects that have to be incorporated. But generally, when you think about the way that it was done, it's the way that it should be, right? And so, again, this focuses on making sure that they're at the table, really knowing how they used to conserve their land, really understanding how to integrate modern technology as well as the modern way that we are city planning in regards to conserving the land, understanding those points around flood zones. That's a really big thing in Prince George's County. Not a lot of people understand that DC and parts of Prince George's County was just one big marsh, one big swamp. And when people make that reference of drain the swamp, it's really because you had to drain the swamp to build DC. It's not a political reference, it's a historical one. But from that perspective, just even understanding those little nuances, right? The people that lived here for hundreds of years know those nuances, understand those nuances, and making sure that they're at the table and respecting their rights and things of that nature. And it's not just it's indigenous people, it's the people in the community that have been there for hundreds of years. As you referenced, the people that were there from antebellum times, they have been there for hundreds of years. And it's also respecting the fact that when black people were taken from Africa and brought over here, they didn't just bring human bodies, they brought over human intelligence. We were farmers and conservationisms and welders and teachers and all those things when they brought us over. They specifically were looking for those skills as they brought us over. And so that skill set didn't just evaporate, right? It was passed on through our family, through our lineage, and it's still there. And so making sure we tap into that as well. But again, can't tap into it if you're not at the table. You're not at the table if you're not picked. You're not picked if the people who represent you don't have that in their mind frame. And I did like what you said about looking who's on staff. That's a very big thing when you talk about politicians. Look who's on their staff. Because a lot of times who their chief of staff is, who their constituent services, who their environmental person is, when you start looking up them and their background, you'll kind of see what those priorities are and how that politician is going to flesh out those priorities. A politician can say a lot of things to your face. Who is on their staff? Who have you spoken to? What does that staff look like? Does that staff look like you and me? Or if that staff doesn't look like you and me, is that staff an ally? Right? So I think it's just very important to make sure that, again, those communities are at the table and their knowledge and wealth base is used in regards to planning. Can someone bring me some water, please?
I don't have anything to add. Literally, that's what I was going to say. I mean, indigenous people, this is their land. They know what to do with it. They know what it is. They know what the best practices are. We should be, and it's really criminal that we are not. We should be, putting their thoughts and ideas and recommendations at the forefront of any thing that we are doing related to the land and conservation in general. And, it just all goes back to this concept of power, because I was watching, I'm a YouTube girl, so I just watch like random stuff on YouTube all the time. Usually true crime. My poor husband's in the back, yeah. But sometimes I like run across random stuff. So I was watching a few weeks ago this video. I don't remember the guy, don't ask. But basically, he goes around different areas of the country and like finds the unpopular things, right, or the misunderstood things. So he decided to do a feature on Native American reservations. And so he did, the normal, stereotypical, what we think of when we see a Native American reservation. But he also did a feature on one of the wealthiest, I think maybe the wealthiest Native American reservation in the entire country. And they had the capital and access to the power to really encourage and cultivate, their ancient and indigenous practices. And the difference in, like, literally, there was a shot where he's on some lake or river or something, I don't know, but you can look at this water and it's pristine and there's like fish and like it's just beautiful and amazing, and you go maybe 40 feet to the other side where we're no longer in Reservation County, and the difference is stark. So just witnessing what the possibilities are when you do have that power and access to capital and a seat at the table, I really think that's kind of what it's all about, like listening to the people who know what they're talking about.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you guys for those answers. We appreciate it. And we've talked a lot earlier in this panel. We spoke about the word intersectionality. That's something that, of course, applies everywhere, as the word insinuates. So the next question that we have is, how does climate change intersect with environmental justice, and what actions can be taken to address this issue equitably?
So how does climate change intersect with environmental justice? Well, I mean, there is almost inseparable. I mean, the idea that, as we mentioned before, like people who are dealing with environmental injustices are usually at the front lines of climate change. They live literally on the riverbanks where flooding happens. They live at the coastline where storms like hit the hardest. They live in the areas where being overtaken by drought and famine. Like the Sahel across Africa has been drought-ridden, which leads to increasing conflicts and wars. Like these are the things that happen to communities first and worst impacted. This is why groups across the global south are calling for loss and damage funding to support the needs of these communities that have been historically embattled by climate change as it's been occurring, as like rich developed nations have been spewing the greenhouse gases and pollution from fossil fuels into the air for 100 years. And now like the impacts are not just in those communities, but they're happening across the world. Like the continent of Africa, like literally like the entire continent, all of the countries across it, 67, are responsible for maybe like 1% of the greenhouse gas pollution, the greenhouse gas impacts in the atmosphere. However, the continent is subject to maybe like 30 to 40% of the impacts from it. And so that's the disproportionate impacts that we're talking about, and how climate change impacts environmental justice communities.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to add. You're right. It's really impossible to separate the concept of environmental justice with climate preparedness, and climate change. And of course, it's because of this disproportionate burden of environmental inequity that we've had to bear forever, but it's also sort of the disproportionate distribution of resources related to climate readiness as well. Even the Justice 40 money, I'm not going to completely disparage it because there are definitely some great programs, but you're hearing more and more stories of this money being sort of funneled into community and then right back out of the community, right? Like people will have programs and they're like, okay, well, we're gonna, do this climate readiness program for this frontline community. And then the money ends up being used for something completely unrelated to what the community actually said that they wanted the money to be used for. And so, you just kind of see it continue to play out. And I think, one thing that we absolutely should be doing in terms of addressing this problem is really having more conversations about what does climate readiness really mean? Because I think a lot of people conflate. Climate change has become so political. It's such a political conversation that people kind of balk and just stop listening when you say it. And really the focus should be on, all right, well, regardless of whether climate change is real or not, it is, spoiler alert, but regardless of whether it's real or not, like there are still these frontline communities that are dealing with these issues increasingly, and the issues are getting worse. So like, what does it mean to mitigate those problems? How can we continue to do that? And really just what does that look like in the long run? So
I just want to say ditto again, but I also wanted to highlight something that you guys both kind of said in your answers earlier that kind of tie in, like climate change and environmental injustice are all intersected with just, economic injustice, redlining, all these different things. Like when you talk about people who lived on the banks of the river, that's because you probably couldn't buy a house in this area, and that redlining, or because you were just told this is where you have to be, right? And so then you are on the front lines of this climate change. And then climate preparedness in regards to making sure that, hey, these things that I'm dealing with, that we all have the readiness for it, and not receiving those, funds. Not even sitting down and having a conversation with the community around how the climate change is affecting them. So for example, or even how construction done inappropriately can speed up climate change issues within your community. Not even kind of expressing all that, talking to people about that, educating people on that. That causes additional issues. And so I just kind of wanted to just reinforce the fact that, yeah, environmental injustice, climate change, that's all tied to racism, systemic racism, as well as, the environmental, the economic injustices that put people in the places of where once those disastrous effects of climate change happen, they are the ones receiving the worst, on the worst end of it. So.
Ms. Parker, you might be one step ahead of me on my next question. You almost answered it outright. So the next question that I have for you all, which Ms. Parker, partially answered there. Hey, we love that. The next question is, what are the economic implications of environmental justice and conservation, and how can we strike a balance between economic development and environmental protection?
I think, oh wow, I'm probably gonna have you to repeat that question, but I know one part that I thought about consistently was how, so for example, in Prince George's County, there's a lot of flood areas, right? And you have to get flood insurance in certain places you don't, right? But then when there's construction, it creates another floodplain or another issue in these areas that were if the range is from 1 to 10 and 10 is a high flood area, your range might have been at a 3, and they just did this construction and now your range is at a 6 or a 7, right? And then you might not be economically prepared for a flood and for your for your basement to flood, right? Having to pump out that water, having to make sure that there's no mold growing in your home now from a health perspective, to make sure that you're dealing with the items that have been destroyed financially. It could have been your laptop that you use for your business. And so when I think about those economic issues and how climate change and affects economically, there's a lot of areas, a lot of people, the marginalized communities are the ones that have the worst effects of climate change, and 9 times out of 10, because there's no preparedness for that climate change, suffer a large economic loss because of it. And one of the things that we can do to kind of mitigate that is what my co-panelist Ebony said earlier in regards to climate readiness, really consistent, true, and honest climate readiness, right? Also educating our elected officials on what will happen if you do this thing, right? Because sometimes we're not honest about who we elect, right? Because you're electing people that have to make decisions on a wide range of interconnecting things. They have to make decisions on education, food industry things, zoning, planning. They have to do a lot of things, and their background might be just in legalese and being a lawyer. But you don't know anything about planning. You don't know anything about conservationism. You don't know anything about this portion of it. So making sure that we are understanding of what our elected officials know versus what we need to educate them about and how we need to keep them on track of what needs to be done. I think that can really tie into these economic parameters of making sure that we are preparing people that might be in this space to have a huge economic loss because of climate change.
I don't really have anything to add, but I did want to, I guess, give another anecdote. So in Philly, there's an area, it's called Eastwick. It's southwest Philadelphia. It's a really beautiful area. It's right outside of the largest, or one of the largest, like, nature conservancies in the country, or the largest urban nature conservancy in the country. There we go. But it's really prone to flooding. There are a couple of Superfund sites down in Eastwick. It's just below sea level. There's an area in Eastwick, it's called the sinking home, so that's what the people refer to it colloquially as. And it's literally an area where the homes are sinking and have been sinking for a really long time. There's also all kinds of lead in the soil, just all kinds of contamination. And so a couple of years ago, this was during COVID, I got a call. There was a huge storm. And I got a call the next day from a few community members who were saying that while they were back trying to get their belongings, because the city told them, okay, you can go back into your homes and try to get your stuff, they got really sick. A couple of people fainted. They were developing rashes and headaches and all kinds of craziness. And so the logical conclusion would be, right, okay, well, there was a flood. There's flood water. Obviously, the flood water is contaminated with something. Stop telling people to go to their houses and get their things. That's not what happened. Of course, that's not what happened. The city doubled down, the EPA doubled down and said, oh, the water is fine. We tested it. You can continue to go. And even with all of these people saying, yeah, we feel really sick, or we felt really sick, or, they have this rash, or so-and-so is at the hospital, they still didn't want to believe it. And so that brings me back to, I know the question was about economic development, but it brings me back to, we are the most at risk for economic losses, as you mentioned, while there's, this wealth being generated elsewhere. A lot of the flooding has gotten worse in Eastwick because of the construction that's happening in Center City and some of the other more gentrifying areas. And, we bear the most harms, and at the same time, we're not taken seriously. They do not listen to what we say. And so it really becomes a conversation, again, about who is at the table and making sure that you elect the right people and making sure that you have the right people in positions of power, because how easy would it have been for somebody at EPA to be like, hey, okay, well, if you got more than one person saying they got a rash from some flood water, maybe you should stop telling people to go back in and getting their stuff. Let's do some more tests.
They will gaslight you. They will gaslight you. And so it's very important to have someone at the table that is, thinking rationally and will say oh no, this doesn't make sense. Because they will gaslight you. Oh, you're not sick. Oh, you got sick too? well, that's on you. There's probably something you eating. No, this is all flood water. This is all contaminated.
Absolutely. Thank you for those answers. A recurring theme that we've heard through all of these answers is that it matters who's at the table. So the theme of this conference is the road to 2024. So I think we should now know how important it is to vote, especially in the realm of environmental justice. So that concludes all of the questions from myself, the moderator. We want to open up the floor now to anybody in the audience who may have a question. Yes.
Speaking about environmental justice, what are your thoughts on AOC's Green New Deal? Do you think that it's an outlandish utopian idea? Or do you think that it's going to be as effective as she promises it to be in terms of eradicating unemployment or significantly decreasing unemployment? Also, significantly decreasing U.S.'s carbon emissions, or do you think it's just it's a good step in the right direction?
I think everything is outlandish till a whole other country does it. And it's being done, and it's wonderful, and it's great, and it's, doing all the things. I think her program highlights stuff that's being done in other European countries with fidelity for years that have produced the results that, she is claiming that will come with her deal. And again, I just feel like everything is outlandish when we put it forth to be done for our country, right? But then when you look at they're doing it, and it's great, it's wonderful. It comes to be like, well, why is this outlandish? Like, why is this wrong? And I always kind of come back to the question of, okay, what's the real issue here? Like, why don't you really want to do it? Like, if all these things could happen, you could have fresher water, cleaner air, lower carbon emissions, more jobs, boosting the economy. It's going to be rainbows every 2 weeks. What's the problem of having it done? So I do think that it can work. I do think that it can be successful. I think there are going to be a lot of challenges to it because there are going to be people that always want to, you come with a loaded deck and they're just going to try to take away as many cards as they can. And then when the house of cards collapse, they blame it on you. See, we told you this wasn't going to work, but you took away this protection, that protection, this job. So yeah, now it's not going to work because the original intent of the bill is this. But I think if it's put in, operated with fidelity, having communities of color and indigenous communities at the table, really focusing on them, I think it could be done. I think it could be done well. I'm always thinking in my mind, like when we talk about America being the greatest and America being wonderful, if we take that seriously, then why aren't we doing the things that other countries are doing to really reinforce that with our public in regards to the health and welfare of our community, of our environment, and of our people? So those are just my thoughts.
Just want to chime in on that. So, and it sounds like you sound like a person who wants to be like more involved as you're looking up like the Green New Deal. And so like the Green New Deal is, it's a proposal, it's a legislative proposal as well, but it's never passed. So like there are elements of it in different pieces of legislation that have passed or different like executive orders and things. So like things that we're doing now tied to whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act or like the America like Conserve like 30 by 30 plan. But in whole, like the Green New Deal is an idea around like reforming our entire economy around ideas of making sure that we are looking at conservation, we're looking at equitable implementation of environmental justice. And so it was spearheaded legislatively by people like AOC, but it is not, the Green New Deal network is now its own thing. And so that's something that I would encourage you to get involved with. In fact, they just had a happy hour, which several members of Congress, including Rashida Tlaib, Senator Markey, came to just in Northeast DC a few weeks ago to try and rally folks and get them to understand that we can't achieve this future that we're talking about without including like environmental justice and labor. And so that ties into like the intersectionality of these movements. So please get involved. Please learn more about that. And like yes, it is aspirational, but everything to the point we were saying that's ludicrous or just aspirational until it happens. The original New Deal was ludicrous until it happened, thanks to our, President Eleanor Roosevelt.
Good afternoon. My name is Lawrence Grand Prix. I'm Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a think tank out of Baltimore. So it's clear to me that with the climate movement, that's a push to make sure that black folks get compensated for the environmental leadership they've done over decades. My question is that in addition to making sure black folks are getting paid to lead the existing oeuvre of environmental justice work, how do we ensure that there's an environmental justice movement created by, accountable to, and generated by working class black people, and that we have the ability to pursue those agendas as well in the event that they might contradict and clash with other people's environmentalism agendas. So a brief example, heat pumps, same thing you do for AC, you can do for heat, environmentally conscious, you can easily install them. You don't have to go to a bunch of schooling for it. But when you talk about getting thousands of people coming home from prison, maybe they got caught up for a weed charge, installing heat pumps. The hang up is the unions. The hang up is the people who give money to Democrats. They're actually the opposition to that. So I think there are elements of working class black environmental leadership that need to be pushed forward vigorously, but may not be as sexy and may not be as prominent in the environmental movement. So how do we ensure those elements come to the forefront?
And first of all, thank you from the beautiful struggle of Baltimore. I love Baltimore. It's one of my favorite cities. Coppin. CSU. But what I will say is that, it's not sexy, because what I talked about initially in my first response was how conservationism it's whitewashed, right? And that's what's being pushed a lot of times when you talk about conservationism, climate change, and environmentalism in general. You have that perspective, and you constantly have to challenge that narrative when you're talking about environmental justice. And to your point about black labor and how that is effective or affected by generally the thought process against environmental injustice, general conservationism and environmentalism. I just kind of reiterate the point that you really have to just fight against that narrative, but you also have to hold accountable the people that you have elected. To your point, it is, the legislature that is predominantly a Democrat that is pushing against that in relation to that particular issue. And so, I voted for you. Yes, I'm a Democrat. Yes, you look like me. But if you are going to vote against the black laborer, if you are not going to have a really in-depth, consistent, and purposeful plan for reentry citizens, then that's an issue. And that's something you have to call out. I feel like a lot of times we don't call it out because there's this big partisan issue, right? And that has its place for another time and another discussion. But the issue about it is, for me, if I voted for you, then you should be pushing what I am saying. And what I am looking for is this. And I think when you talk about pushing the black labor movement, you should be pulling on people that have been systemically, in the black labor movement. I think Senator Cory McCray from Baltimore is in the Black Trades Union, if I'm not mistaken, and has been for years, and talks about that sort of educational practice and policy. So making sure that we're pulling on them to be champions for these types of environmental issues, and then talking to them about the intersectionality of that, talking to them about the intersectionality of reentry citizens, and how they could be a crucial part about environmental injustice. Just even with the way that we feed, right? Our incarcerated community members. I think a lot of people, that might have went over people's heads, but our incarcerated people are our incarcerated community members, right? They're just away from us at this time. And if we don't take the time to make sure that they have what they need, they're not going to reintroduce into society in a positive and productive way. and that's on us, right? But there's all these different levels of intersectionality. How we're procuring food, how we're doing food, how we're serving food, all that ties into environmental injustice and climate change. Are you using black and brown farmers? Are you using people of local economics? So just to your point about black labor and black, just tying those together again, I just always go back to the political power as well as grassroots power.
I just want to add to that. Thank you for that answer. I think, this is a really good question. And issues like this are why programs like the Justice 40 and, just the Inflation Reduction Act funding in general is so important, because a lot of times you will see that, yes, the environmental justice movement in some areas has been corrupted and co-opted, and that's by, I don't want to say design. I'm a little bit of a conspiracy theorist. I'm working on it. I'm trying to get better. But, honestly, we have so many amazing grassroots community organizations that are trying their hardest to do this work year in and year out. They're not getting any big grant funding. They don't have any donors. It's just people who love their community and their neighborhood, and they want to do the thing, right? But over time, when you see that year after year, the policy's not changing, or conditions are getting worse, or nobody cares, you get burnt out. And on top of the fact that, you got real stuff to deal with. Like, you got to go to work. I probably can't really miss work to attend this licenses and inspections hearing to contest the zoning variance because this developer wants to put a condo in the community garden. Like, I can't do that. And so over time, we've had to rely more and more heavily on allies to help us push this work forward. But then what happens is you get less and less frontline community people, at the table involved in the conversations about the real solutions, and you get people inserting what they think. Honestly, they probably feel like they're doing a great thing. Like, they feel like this makes sense. That's a great solution, but it's not really a great solution for this community. And so that's why it's so important that we keep pushing for and encouraging, programs like Justice 40 and IRA, and just funding in general to pay people for their time and their labor so they can focus on doing the work that needs to be done, and they can continue, again, the theme, to have a seat at the table.
I think that part of the answer is in your own question, like talking about like how to organize folks. You were talking about heat pumps. You're talking about things like people being able to install solar panels, like talking to people at, about like environmental justice doesn't have to be lofty. We can talk about like how people organize on the ground with the things that impact their daily lives, like organize people around their utility bills against like the utility company that doesn't let them use renewable energy. That ends up lowering the cost of their bills. Organize people through the labor unions who are working and can have power to actually do mass buys on the products that they use in terms of flexing their power. Divest from banks that are fossil fuel driven and move into community credit unions, CDFIs, minority development financial institutions, things like that. So I hear your point, but I think like you already got the answer. It's just that you got to get more folks to like follow and come with you, and that's part of the charge of leadership.
I want to say, though, also, it's about telling a story, right? Making sure that you're expressing the experiences that people are going through and really connecting it to the people that you're talking to, knowing your audience. In certain areas, there's a high level of classism, in the black community. And you have to know your audience when you're talking to them about the issues and bringing them on board. And I know it's something that we don't like to talk about or address a lot, but it's real. It's a very real thing, that level of classism and how that plays into how people will support like the black labor movement and the environmental movement and environmental injustice when they look like you, right? A lot of times the oppressed want to mimic the oppressor, and you have to break down that thought process to bring them along to where we all could be free.
All right. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
My question is just about Cop City and what's going on in Atlanta and what lessons we can take from that experience as it's playing out in real time. Because I know this is a conference about us, getting our ducks in a row ahead of the federal election, and what we see now playing out in Atlanta. There's a RICO charge against organizers and citizens who have been advocating and doing what they're supposed to do, submitting their comments, reaching out to their legislators. They've been being ignored because the city is not really respecting their commentary on the subject. So I just was curious to hear you guys' thoughts about the situation in Cop City as a whole, but then also what lessons we specifically as Black people need to be taking from this experience with us into the voting booth in 2024.
Did we plant you in the audience? Because it's the Hip Hop Caucus. That's what we do. In fact, our director of Respect My Vote is in the back over there. So he's focused on things around civil engagement and voting engagement. And that's one of the things that we've been focused on. We've tried to keep an eye on Cop City really since the beginning of this year, and keeping pressure on local government to make sure that all of the citizens' votes are counted and that people actually have a voice to say about the police and militarized training institution that's being put in their backyard and has been used as a way of, continuing the oppression of Black people. This is, again, like an example of intersectionality that is happening both in the environmental movement, that is happening in the labor movement, that's happening in the police reform movement. And these are the example of how this comes together to impact the Black community first and worst. And also to talk about violence among ourselves. We have a majority Black city council and a Black mayor in a majority Black city that is pushing forward with something that the people at first didn't really know about, and now that they know about it, they've collected enough signatures, delivered them, and then the institution was trying to keep those signatures from being accepted. They were trying to keep them from being looked at. The people who are in the forest, in the Wheeleney Forest, trying to protest this facility from being built, which would add to more pollution, that would destroy the natural forest canopy of the city, are being charged with basically with domestic terrorism charges. And they're using federal racketeering charges that were originally conspired to be used against mobsters in the 20s and 30s, to say that these folks, most of them just young kids who were volunteering and taking their own time to sit and throwing rocks at police officers who had guns, and then they were one of them who was gunned down and shot by autopsy shown 50 plus times gives me memories of Amadou Diallo in New York. And so this is the same thing that persists and is happening again. And unfortunately, we're trying to highlight it because it gives people a taste of this is what's coming if we don't start waking up and paying attention to what's happening in terms of environmental justice in this country. And these are the sorts of things that have been happening across the world to environmental defenders when they try to stand up against the fossil fuel industry, when they try to stand up against the police military industrial complex. And so while some may see oh, what's the big deal about this? It's if you let these little things go, which aren't little things, then they become bigger things. Then you have another facility in Nashville, then you have another facility in Baltimore, and all of a sudden you have the Gestapo coming around trying to stop us just from organizing ourselves. And so we can't let that point get there, and so we have to continue fighting back. So right now, we were just at a press conference yesterday to make sure that it was known that the people are still pushing back against us. We're going to continue organizing and fighting against Cop City, and actually, the longer that we've been raising this issue, more and more people have been coming on board, both locally in the community and nationally, coming into this fight to understand that this is an issue that the people of Atlanta need to have a say about, and the people of Georgia need to be able to help organize around because it impacts all of them.
One of the things that, again, it's going to be a thread for me, I live in Prince George's County. We have predominantly Black legislators, predominantly Black and brown representation. And I think one of the things that my co-panelist said that really resonates with me is that this is the violence that we perpetuate upon ourselves. And being really honest about that, being really honest that you elected these people and now they're not listening to you. Being really honest about, okay, these local elections, these municipality, city elections, these county council elections, these state legislator elections, these matter just as much as a federal election. And they matter just as much because they're putting in laws and ordinances and all these sorts of things that affect your daily, everyday life. Daily, everyday, that was redundant. But you're putting, that's that's a very important election cycle too. And I think Cop City, kind of shows that. These people were elected. They look like you and me. And they are not trying to accept the signatures. They're not trying to do this. They're not trying to do that. And so it just really reinforces for me, again, just because they look like us, don't mean that they for us. And you really have to sit and ask yourself about institutionality and how we're electing people that are really entrenched in the institutions that are causing our people harm. Just recently, in Prince George's County, the first pregnant county council member ever asked for the ability to vote virtually while she was on maternity leave. And they voted it down. This is a county that is predominantly black. This is a county that has one of the highest black women mortality rates for maternal health and medicine and things of that nature. And the people that look like you and me told their colleague, we're not going to give you a reasonable accommodation so that you can continue to represent your community. And then one of the council members looked at her and said, you are making yourself out to be the victim. Can you imagine that? But he's elected to office. And so I feel like when we're having these conversations, we really need to start looking at the track record of these people. Not just what you do when you come knock on my door. Oh, okay, you've been on the council before. You was here for 4 years. Oh, okay. So I can go back and look at some of the high, intensity votes and how you voted. Because that's really the issue. We have to stop electing people who look like us that are going to reinforce institutionalized policies that are going to continue the harm, within our communities. Because you're going to see that on an environmental level, an economic level, a social justice level, all those things. So.
All right, everybody, that concludes our panel for today, our final panel. If we could have a round of applause for our panelists. And a